In front of hundreds of guests dressed in their finest, under chandeliers dripping with crystals and flashing cameras, a silence cut through the music. Then came the sound, sharp, stinging, echoing across the hall. The billionaire's new wife had just raised her hand and struck the pregnant maid across the face. Gasps filled the air. Some people even dropped their champagne flutes, and the bride's ivory gown seemed almost to glow with rage. The maid stumbled back, clutching her cheek, her swollen belly trembling with each breath. Everyone froze, the groom included. For a moment, it felt as if time itself had stopped. But it wasn't the slap that would haunt the room, it was what happened next. Because buried in that moment was a secret so heavy, it threatened to shatter the very foundation of the new couple's life. And the maid, quiet and trembling, held the key. Before we go deeper into this story, let me ask you this. How would you feel if you witnessed such a moment at a wedding? Would you stand by in shock or step forward? Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because trust me, what you're about to hear is not just a wedding gone wrong. It's a story about power, betrayal, and a choice that shocked everyone who thought they knew the truth. Her name was Elena, though some in the mansion called her Nora. She had been working for the family for nearly 3 years. Humble, quiet, and with a heart that carried more burdens than her young shoulders should ever have known, she was 5 months pregnant when the wedding was announced. She rarely spoke about the father of her child, never let her personal troubles interfere with her work, and yet those close enough could see the exhaustion in her eyes and the way she often held her stomach as if to shield the life inside. Guests whispered that she shouldn't even have been present that day, that a maid had no place at a billionaire's wedding. But Elena wasn't just any maid. She was tied to this story in ways the glittering crowd could not yet imagine. She carried secrets that could either destroy her or change everything forever. The groom, Christopher, stood tall at the altar, every inch the picture of charm and power. To the public, he was the self-made billionaire who embodied success, a man people admired and envied in equal measure. His smile was disarming, his words carried weight, and his fortune stretched across businesses that had made headlines for years. Yet behind the polished exterior was a man hiding cracks too dangerous to reveal. Whispers had long circulated of his wandering heart, of private encounters that contradicted the picture-perfect image splashed across glossy magazines. But for this day, in front of cameras and reporters, Christopher was the devoted husband-to-be, eager to cement his legacy with a woman society adored. Little did anyone know, his past choices had already walked into the wedding hall, silent but heavy, waiting for the moment when truth would collide with appearances. And then there was Isabella, graceful, elegant, adored by every guest who had been lucky enough to receive an invitation. Her dress, custom-made by a world-renowned designer, shimmered as she moved. To her friends, she was the woman who had it all: beauty, wealth, and now the perfect husband. But to Isabella herself, the wedding was more than a celebration. It was her chance to prove to the world that she belonged at the very top of society, untouchable, flawless. Every glance she gave was measured, every smile carefully placed. She was protective of her image, unwilling to let anything threaten it. So when she noticed Elena standing in the corner of the grand ballroom, a maid with trembling hands and a belly that could no longer be hidden beneath loose fabric, something inside her shifted. Guests leaned into each other and murmured, "Why was the maid here? And why did the groom's eyes seem to linger for just a second too long?" Long before the wedding bells, Elena had first met Christopher in the quiet corners of the estate. He was not the billionaire in tailored suits then, not to her at least. He was the man who lingered in the kitchen late at night, asking questions about her life, listening as she spoke about her struggles, her dreams, her family she barely saw. What began as stolen conversations quickly grew into something deeper. Christopher made promises no one had ever made to her before, that she mattered, that he cared, that she would never again have to fight life's battles alone. For Elena, those words were a lifeline, something she held close in the quiet hours when the weight of loneliness pressed on her chest. She believed him. She trusted him. And in that trust, their secret relationship unfolded, hidden in the shadows of a house too big to ever keep silent. When Elena discovered she was pregnant, fear and hope tangled inside her. She remembers the night she told him, how his face had shifted from surprise to something almost tender. He promised he would take care of her, that the child was not a mistake but a blessing. He said he would never let her stand alone, never let her be shamed for something that was theirs together. In that moment, she believed she had found not only love but also safety. Yet promises are fragile things when weighed against ambition, because as plans for his engagement to Isabella began to surface in glossy society magazines, Christopher's visits grew shorter, his words less certain, until finally, one day, he simply disappeared. No explanation, no final conversation. Just a silence that pressed against her heart until she realized the man she thought she knew had chosen a future without her, and without their child. Now, standing inside the grand wedding hall, Elena's hands trembled as she set down crystal glasses and adjusted flower arrangements. The laughter of guests, the clinking of silverware, and the music swelling around her felt like sharp echoes against her pounding heart. She tried to avoid his gaze, but every time her eyes wandered across the room, they found him. The man who once held her in secret now stood proudly at the altar, smiling as though nothing had ever passed between them. And yet, behind that smile, Elena saw the same flicker she once knew, the recognition, the guilt, the fear of what she carried with her. Guests whispered about her presence, but none of them knew the truth. The question lingered in the air like smoke. Why was she really there that day? And what secret did she hold that could bring the entire ceremony crashing down in a single breath? As the evening carried on, Isabella's radiant smile began to stiffen. It wasn't just the glittering lights or the countless toasts made in their honor. It was Elena. Isabella noticed the way the maid's gaze lingered, not with arrogance, but with something heavier, something unsettled. A woman 5 months pregnant, serving wine and balancing trays, her hands trembling just enough to betray her emotions. Isabella tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing. She had spent years in the spotlight, years reading people and knowing when something was wrong, and in that moment, she felt it. A presence that wasn't supposed to be there. A question no one dared to ask aloud. Why was the maid, visibly struggling under the weight of her pregnancy, working at a wedding where every detail had been curated for perfection? For Isabella, that question wasn't just inconvenient, it was threatening. Guests began to notice too. The whispers spread like wildfire, slipping between tables, hidden behind champagne flutes and polite laughter. "Isn't that the maid who used to—" one voice murmured, only to be hushed quickly by another. People leaned closer, stealing glances at Christopher, then back at Elena. A few even exchanged knowing looks, as if remembering glimpses they'd seen in the past, a passing smile, an unusual kindness, a moment of closeness that now seemed glaring in hindsight. The air thickened, not with joy or celebration, but with suspicion. And though the music played on, the notes seemed brittle, the laughter forced. It was no longer just a wedding. It was a stage, and everyone could feel an unseen drama beginning to unfold just beneath the surface. Then came the small incidents that pushed the tension further. As Elena poured wine for a group of guests, the stem of a crystal glass nearly slipped from her hand. The sound of it clinking sharply against the table silenced a corner of the room for just a breath too long. Isabella's eyes darted toward her instantly, and Christopher's followed, a flash of recognition he couldn't quite mask. For the briefest second, their eyes met, Elena's and Christopher's, and it was enough. Isabella saw it, not just a glance, but something deeper, something unspoken that could not be faked. Her chest tightened as realization clawed at her composure. She leaned closer to Christopher, her voice calm but edged with steel, and whispered through clenched teeth, "Why is she here?" Christopher forced a smile, attempting to brush it off, but Isabella knew him well enough to see the hesitation, the way his jaw tightened before he spoke. She didn't press further, not yet, but the damage had already been done. Doubt had crept into her heart, and suspicion had taken root among the guests. Elena, meanwhile, kept her head down, unaware of how quickly the walls were closing in around her. She had entered this wedding quietly, but now eyes were on her, questions were forming, and the truth she carried within her was no longer safe. And just as the tension reached its peak, something happened that no one in that hall could have predicted, a moment so shocking that it would forever be remembered. Not for the love celebrated that day, but for the scandal that erupted before the night was over. It was only a matter of time before the pressure broke. Isabella, who had spent the entire evening trying to maintain her composure, could no longer ignore the gnawing suspicion inside her. The smile on her face faded as she rose from her chair, heels clicking against the marble floor, her gown trailing behind her like a storm cloud. She walked toward Elena with deliberate steps, each one drawing the attention of curious eyes. The music softened, conversations hushed, and all at once the atmosphere shifted. Isabella stood face to face with the trembling maid, her voice steady but sharp as a blade. "Why are you here? Who allowed this?" Her question cut through the hall, demanding an answer. Elena froze, her heart pounding, her hands clutching the tray tighter, and in that silence, every guest leaned forward, waiting, sensing that something much larger was about to unravel. Christopher quickly moved closer, his face tightening, whispering for Isabella to sit down, to let it go. But Isabella wasn't listening. The suspicion in her eyes burned brighter, and the cracks in Christopher's carefully built facade began to show. "You keep looking at her," she pressed, her voice rising just enough for the nearest guests to hear. "Tell me why." Elena's breathing grew heavier, her hands shaking as though the weight of years of silence were pressing against her chest. The crowd watched, gasps and murmurs spreading like a wave across the hall. For Elena, there was no escape left. The truth she had carried in secret could no longer stay hidden, and when she finally lifted her head, her words shattered the room. "Ask your husband why he left me pregnant." The impact of those words was instant. Gasps erupted from the crowd, some covering their mouths in shock, others turning toward Christopher with eyes wide in disbelief. Isabella staggered back, her face pale, the room spinning around her as the whispers turned into an uproar. Christopher tried to speak, tried to defend himself, but the silence he had once chosen now roared back at him with devastating force. Elena stood trembling, tears filling her eyes, her hand resting protectively on her stomach. She had spoken the truth, and though it shook her to the core, she could no longer be silenced. That one confession had transformed a wedding into a battlefield, and the consequences were about to unfold before everyone's eyes. If you're still here, drop a comment with, "I'm still watching." Let's see who's paying attention. Because what comes next will leave you questioning loyalty, betrayal, and the price of silence. The hall stood still for a heartbeat, heavy with disbelief. Then, in a flash of fury, Isabella's hand cut through the air and landed across Elena's face. The sound cracked through the silence, sharper than the music, sharper than the whispers that had been building all night. Elena stumbled back, clutching her cheek as tears welled in her eyes, her pregnant body trembling under the weight of humiliation. Guests gasped, some even rising from their seats, while others pulled out phones, cameras flashing as the moment was immortalized in 1,000 lenses. This was no longer a private scandal. It was public, undeniable, and irreversible. Isabella stood shaking, her chest rising and falling as rage consumed her. Christopher rushed forward, his hands raised, urging her to calm down, but his words fell flat against the storm. He was no longer in control, not of the wedding, not of his wife, and not of the truth. As he tried to explain, his voice cracked under pressure, and the crowd pressed in closer, desperate for answers. But the whispers were louder now, feeding off the chaos. Guests leaned toward one another, voices sharp with speculation. "It's true. She's the maid he was with. She's carrying his child." The perfect wedding had become a stage for betrayal, and no amount of money or status could silence the evidence now spilling into the open. Elena lowered her head, but her silence spoke louder than anything Christopher could say. Every glance, every unfinished sentence, every flicker of guilt in his eyes confirmed what many had already suspected. He tried to reach for Isabella, but she pulled back, her hand trembling with the sting of betrayal. The man she thought she knew now stood exposed before everyone, and the cracks in their union widened into a chasm that could no longer be ignored. And then came the most damning blow, not from words spoken aloud, but from the proof that began to emerge. A friend of the family whispered about messages, private promises that Christopher had made to Elena. Texts filled with declarations of love, assurances that she would never be left behind, even late-night photos exchanged when the world was asleep. Pieces of the past surfaced like ghosts in the crowd, undeniable, unerasable. For Isabella, it wasn't just Elena's words anymore. It was evidence that confirmed her deepest fears. Her world, so carefully built on reputation and appearances, was unraveling before her eyes. Elena stood with tears slipping silently down her face, but even in her pain, there was a quiet strength. She no longer needed to prove herself. The truth was already out, and yet, as heavy as the moment was, the worst had not yet revealed itself. Because what came next would leave the room stunned into silence once more. But the worst was yet to come. The scandal spread faster than anyone could contain it. Cameras that had been meant to capture the elegance of the wedding now captured its collapse. Reporters outside the venue received live updates from guests too eager to whisper the unfolding drama. By the time dessert was being served, the headlines were already circulating online. "Billionaire's wedding interrupted by pregnant maid's shocking claim." The story could no longer be silenced. Isabella tried to retreat, her hands trembling as she attempted to maintain a shred of dignity. But the damage was already done. Christopher's reputation, built on charm and success, now stood at the edge of ruin. Yet amid the noise and flashing cameras, all eyes turned back to Elena. She stood quietly, the weight of her truth finally spoken. But the decision of whether to walk away or continue remained hers alone. And in that moment, she chose to speak. Her voice was soft at first, trembling, but each word carried the power of years she had endured alone. She told her story in front of the crowd, how Christopher had sought her out, how he had filled her heart with promises of love and security, how he had looked her in the eye and assured her their child would never be a burden. She spoke of the night she told him she was pregnant and the comfort of his embrace, the words he whispered, words that vanished when the wedding plans with Isabella emerged. And then she spoke of the silence, the abandonment, the months of working through exhaustion while carrying a child she could barely provide for, surviving without the help of the man who had sworn to protect her. The room was silent as she spoke. Not even a glass clinked, for no one dared interrupt the weight of her truth. The guests themselves began to shift. Some leaned closer to Isabella, offering sympathetic looks, but others turned their attention to Elena with a kind of respect. They saw not just a maid, but a woman wronged, a woman who had been forced into silence while the man who promised her everything celebrated his new beginning with someone else. A divide formed among the crowd, some whispering in defense of Christopher, blaming Elena for ruining the night, while others called him a coward, a man unworthy of either woman's love. And for Isabella, every word from Elena was another blow to the carefully curated image she had believed in. The man she had married wasn't the loyal partner she imagined, but someone capable of betrayal, capable of building his empire on lies. She stood frozen, her gown still sparkling under the lights, but inside, her world was crumbling. Would she stand by him, or walk away? At last, the confrontation could no longer be contained. Isabella turned to her husband, her voice trembling but loud enough for every guest to hear. "Is it true?" she demanded, her eyes locked on Christopher's face, her hands shaking as if the weight of every broken promise had landed all at once. Christopher stammered, his words falling apart as he tried to deny, tried to weave excuses, but the crowd was no longer convinced. The whispers of evidence, the messages, the photos, the promises, were too strong to ignore. His charm, once his greatest weapon, was powerless in the face of truth. Isabella's tears glistened under the chandeliers as her fury overtook her. She no longer cared for appearances, no longer cared for the cameras flashing in every direction. She pointed at him, her voice breaking, "You are not the man I thought I married." And then she turned away. With each step she took, the wedding unraveled further. The bride, once the centerpiece of admiration, stormed out of the hall with her gown dragging behind her like a banner of defeat. Gasps followed her departure, and the doors closing behind her echoed like the final strike of a gavel. Christopher remained standing, his face drained of color, left alone under the crushing weight of humiliation. He looked around for sympathy, for someone to defend him, but the very people who once celebrated his power now turned their eyes away. His empire of lies had been built carefully, piece by piece, but in one night it collapsed before the entire world, and in that moment of ruin, Elena did not gloat, did not smile at his downfall. Instead, she placed her trembling hand on her belly, her eyes filled with tears, and quietly walked away, her dignity intact, her silence louder than any words. In one night, the empire of lies crumbled. In the days that followed, the aftermath unfolded with a weight that none of the guests could forget. Isabella moved swiftly, filing for annulment before the ink on the wedding documents had even dried. What had been meant to solidify her place in society became instead a cautionary tale whispered across newsstands and social media feeds. The woman who once stood as a symbol of elegance became a figure of resilience, one who refused to live under the shadow of betrayal. Her decision to walk away marked the end of a marriage before it had truly begun. And while her heart had been broken in front of the world, she reclaimed her dignity by choosing herself above the image of perfection others had forced upon her. The cameras had captured her pain, but they also captured her strength. For Elena, the story did not end with shame, but with an unexpected measure of peace. At first, she feared the judgment of those around her, but what came instead was support. Guests who had once looked down at her offered words of compassion. Strangers online, reading her story, lifted her as a symbol of honesty and courage. Though her journey as a single mother remained uncertain, she was no longer carrying her burden in silence. She had spoken her truth in the very place it was meant to be silenced, and in doing so, she found a quiet strength. The child she carried would one day know not only of betrayal, but of the bravery that brought light into the darkest moment of her life. As for Christopher, the empire he had so carefully constructed began to wither. Investors pulled away, deals collapsed, and his public image, once polished to perfection, lay in ruins. His name, which had once stood as a promise of wealth and power, became instead a headline of disgrace. What he had gained in wealth, he had lost in trust, and the fortune he clung to no longer shielded him from the consequences of his actions. In one night, the lies he lived by were stripped bare, leaving behind only the fragments of a reputation that could never be rebuilt. And so, this story closed not with triumph, but with lessons. Elena was no longer just a maid or a victim. She had become a symbol of truth, proof that even the smallest voice can shatter the grandest illusion. Isabella walked away with her dignity intact, refusing to be chained to deceit, and Christopher was left to face the wreckage of his choices, a reminder that no lie, no matter how carefully hidden, survives forever. But in the end, What do you think? Was justice truly served, or did everyone lose that night? If this story hit you like it did us, hit that like button. It helps us reach more people. And subscribe if you want more gripping stories every week.